Okay. Good day, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Nowruz Mubarak, Happy New Year. And as the previous speakers, I would like to thank you very much, the Iranian Heritage Foundation and the organizers, for inviting us to and allowing us to present the bioarchaeological remains or the results of the bioarchaeology studies at Tappeh Sialk. And Marjan, Mashkour, and Morteza Djamali are very sorry not to be able to be here. And at this moment, they are somewhere in the Dasht Lut, looking at animals and plants. So, bioarchaeology at Tappeh Sialk with surroundings, as you will see. And with bioarchaeology here, we include biological remains of different types. So it's bioarchaeological in a large sense, that is human remains, animal remains, and plant remains. And this type of biological remains from archaeological sites, they inform us on people, of course, on plants and animals, and they inform us also on the interactions between these different elements of the ecosystems, the past ecosystems. And in fact, this lecture will be a sort of a collection of different studies that you will see. We speak about pollen, charcoal, seeds and fruits, faunal studies, and also as the crown of the lecture, the human remains from Tappeh Sialk. So Tappeh Sialk, it's as was said by Dr. Fazeli before, is a fundamental site for understanding the beginnings of agriculture, herding, an agro-pastoral point of lifestyle in the Central Plateau. In fact, as we can see now, the Neolithic, the agricultural villages appear here later than elsewhere in the Iranian context, and we might wonder from where it came and how it began, and that's of course an important question for this site. And I can see there's an error in the dating. I changed it, but it came back in a way, so it's 6,000, not 6,200. I made it a bit older than it is. So that's a very important question. It's also important to see how these interactions between people, plant, and animals evolved through time, changed through time, in the specific context of the Central Plateau. And as you all know, and it's been said several times already, that one of the really important characteristics of this region is aridity. We are in a very arid to a hyper-arid environment with less than 150 millimeters rainfall per year. That means that agriculture is not possible without irrigation, and temperatures are also very high. And of course, this aridity is something that influences a lot the way people are living and how they get organized. And breeding animals and cultivating plants necessitate adaptation to the specific conditions, and also to adopt specific techniques, practices like transhumance, for example, or irrigation. And it has a very big influence on the human living conditions. So it's an important factor. But as has been shown also, Tappeh Sialk is situated in what is sometimes called an oasis, that a place where there's also water, exceptionally in this rather desert environment. And this is there's rich sources of underground water and runoff water, which explain the presence of Paleolithic populations and then the installation of the Neolithic populations, and which explains also the possibility of historic Kashan and the modern city of Kashan being situated in this specific place. And Tappeh Sialk is thus in a specific favorable environment, but surrounded by different biotopes. We have sand dunes to the northeast, a salty lake even further north, and the Karkas Mountains, and that's something very important, to the southwest, where we have a specific biotopes. So the ancient inhabitants of Sialk had access to different habitats with their specific resources, plants and animals. On the foothills of the Karkas Mountains, we have very arid and a bit hostile xeromorphic dwarf shrublands, sand desert with shrubs, specific shrubs, And in the mountains, we have somewhat richer resources with shrublands, with different wild fruit trees, for example. And around the site, we have these gardens and with the presence of water and cultivation and very man-made environment. In general, the environment around Sialk is very much influenced today by human activities, and probably since long, with wood cutting, of course, and grazing and a general impact on the environment. So that's why it's interesting to know what was the environment in the past, what the vegetation cover during the occupation of the site of Sialk. There are not very many means of reconstructing the vegetation cover in the past. Pollen analysis, which is a specialty of Morteza, Djamali, but the problem here is that the environment is arid and pollen is not very well preserved. You need lake beds or humid environments to capture the pollen. But there are pollen in other contexts, and the first study is the pollen analysis from coprolites of hyena, and it's a very specific subject, a little bit marginal to our subject today, but we'll speak about it because it's very close to, it's part of the general environmental study of this area. And it's a study that's ongoing. And in fact, near Sialk, 4 kilometers from Sialk, Kaftarkhun, that was mentioned by Feridun, where they have Paleolithic remains. There are also hyena dens, so the home of hyenas that lived there very recently. So it's a sub-recent site, and the striped hyena. And these striped hyenas, they have brought their animals that they have either killed or found dead already and eaten them on the spot. And in fact, we're not so interested now in the fauna, but I can just mention that there are mostly echids and canids that were eaten by the striped hyena in this spot. And this material was studied by Marjan Mashkour. And in fact, what's more interesting here are the coprolites. It's not a very elegant material, as you can see, but it's interesting because these coprolites in an arid environment where you don't have usual pollen sediments, you can find rich pollen concentrations in these coprolites. In fact, they are resulting from the water that the hyenas drank and from the animals that they have eaten. And they reflect quite widely the environment, the sub-recent environment in the area. So it can be a rich source of information. And so these were studied by Morteza Djamali for the pollen content, and the pollen content was high, and he could read the environment in these coprolites. So he could see that the hyenas had ingested pollen from different types of environments, from the steppe, this sort of shrub steppe, very arid environment, from low-lying saline soils, salty soils with specific flora, from the desert, sand dunes, and also some few surprising species like tulips, and he's wondering if the hyenas were eating tulips or if they were eating animals that were eating tulips. That could also be a possibility. But this shows some different ecosystems around Kaftarkhun. And there are also evidence in these coprolites of human activities like cereal pollens, pulses, cultivated trees like pomegranate, walnut, grapevine, and so on, and evidence of overgrazing with pollen from plants that developed in overgrazed areas, or dung-associated spores. And here you have these dung spores and evidence of, or some images of pollen from pomegranate. So by these hyena coprolites, we have a good image of the regional vegetation with different ecosystems that are reflected. These are sub-recent, but if we have more ancient material, of course, it could be used for reconstructing the ancient environment. Now we'll go over to the Sialk Reconsideration Project and the bioarchaeological studies that have been conducted in relation to these projects, archaeobotany, archaeozoology, and then Céline will speak about the human remains, but connected rather to Gershman's excavations. So archaeobotanists, archaeozoologists participated in this Sialk Reconsideration Project directed by Professor Shahmirzadeh. And here you have Nokander, the Nokander working on the South Mound. And we begin with the vegetation history and the wood collection studied from the charcoal. And charcoal is all over the place, if we say, in the archaeological sediments. Charcoal results from the use of wood as a fuel for cooking and other activities, and was collected in the form of sediment samples. And then the charcoal pieces were extracted by putting them into water. That's what we call the flotation method. And we installed a flotation device on the site, as you can see here. In fact, the archaeobotanical study of Sialk is quite limited. There's not so much material. Archaeobotanical samples were collected only during a very short season in 2003, little in 2003 and then in 2004. But the first results will show you the potential of this type of studies and what we can learn from the study of macrobotanical remains. The charcoal was studied in the framework of a master thesis by Zora Shirazi, who is now in the University of Zahedan. And the charcoal pieces are identified with the help of a microscope. And in fact, the anatomy or the cellular structure of the charcoal pieces that allows the botanical identification, because each species, wood species, has its own structure that can be recognized. And we can see then that the ancient inhabitants of Tappeh Sialk collected wood for fuel, mainly in two different plant formations in the gallery forest. That's a forest that's growing along water, and also in a more steppe, dry environment with shrub and woodlands. And the riparian forest, or the gallery forest, is clearly dominating in the North Mound in the late Neolithic and becomes less important in the South Mound. Does this mean that the gallery forest disappeared or regressed between the two mounds? Maybe, but the problem is that we have very little material. The study is based on an insufficient number of fragments to be we cannot be really sure, and we would need much more material. And it could be a possibility, and this would be very interesting to explore, because as you have seen, the metallurgy was a big activity, an important activity at Sialk South, and metallurgy would have needed a lot of wood, and so it would be interesting to know from where people took the wood for smelting activities, and it would be a big consumption of wood species. In the gallery forest, we have different species: Russian olive, ash tree, willow, tamarisk, typical trees of humid environments. And one of these is specifically interesting. It's the dominant species. It's the Russian olive, Eleagnus, which is the senjet, if I'm not wrong, that is consumed a lot. We don't have the fruits, but we have the wood, and fruits might be found, of course, on the site. The dry shrublands composed of different species, shrub species and tree species, and among these the hackberry, which is also produces edible fruits that can be found on many Neolithic sites. We haven't found them yet on Sialk, but might be there. I put a question mark here because of woody legume, we don't know what it is. We just know the family, but not a specific species. So that was the charcoal analysis, and then we have charred seeds and fruits, and charred seeds and fruits are usually the remains of, usually food remains, or the remains of food plants that might have been charred accidentally when cooking, or it might be seeds and fruits or chaff, for example, that were discarded in the fire when you were cleaning the crops. And these, on the North Mounds, we have mostly cereals, and among those, what we called hulled cereals, and mainly hulled wheat, and primitive wheat type called emmer wheat that was typical characteristic of the Neolithic period. And you can see here the spikelet bases of emmer type hulled wheat that are dominating at this site. And these primitive wheat species, they are called hulled because the chaff is really enclosing the seeds, and you have to dehusk them before consuming them. And that means that we have a lot of remains of chaff on the archaeological sites because people were dehusking on a daily basis, and probably throw the refuse in the fire. We also have barley and some wild species. And this is quite a typical crop spectra for the Neolithic period. And as we could see from Dr. Fazeli's presentation, there's also lentils, which combined with the cereals gave the base of the diet. And in the later periods, we have very few hulled wheat remains, but now becomes more important the naked wheat, the free-threshing wheat, which is the modern wheat type, the one we still use for making bread, the bread wheat type. And there are also some, the apparition of grape and grapevine is found in the Iron Age levels, but it was probably present earlier too, because we have a boom of grape cultivation in the Bronze Age, even since 3000 BC. And on many sites in Iran, from 3000 we have grape, but at Sialk it's been found so far only in the Iron Age period. But as I said, we have a very limited record of archaeobotanical remains. The animal bones have been studied by Marjan Mashkour, and there were many bone remains, quite fragmented, as you can see on these photos, and these results have been published in the different Sialk volumes. In the late Neolithic North Mound, we have a quite diversified faunal spectrum, where there are domestic caprini, that is sheep and goat, and cattle that are important. But hunting is still an important activity in the late Neolithic. Later on the south mound, Sialk 3 and 4, and then Sialk 6, we have differences. There's an evolution, like in the crop spectra, there are differences between the different periods. And we have a more specialized pastoralism in Sialk 3-4 with a very high reliance on caprini, on sheep and goats. And there you can, of course, speculate about the techniques of herding, if they were moved the animals, transhumance, and such questions. And then in the later periods, we have diversified animal herding with the use of domestic equids, donkeys, horses, and that's very important, also interesting when we consider the trade networks. Metallurgy would need transport of heavy things, and we have now domesticated pack animals. There are also archaeological remains in the Girschman collections that he brought back to Paris and that are now kept in the Institute for Human Paleontology in the Natural History Museum in Paris, that are under study by Marjan Mashkour. And these remains are well preserved because, of course, methods were quite different in the 1930s. Archaeology was not really developed in the same way as today, and Girschman brought back nice finds that look nice and are whole. So they give specific information. These are almost objects, but they are of course less representative of the general animal economy than the very fragmented bone that you could see before, that represent more the common daily activities. Now I'll leave to Céline to explain about the human remains.
Hello, and thanks for the organizer for this wonderful conference. It's really interesting. I'm very pleased to be here for presenting our ongoing project on the human remains from the Girschman collection that are conserved in the Museum Anthropological Collection. So this project is part of a wider project on population migration on southwestern Central Asia, diet reconstruction, and also the health state of the population. So the archaeological site includes Tappeh Sialk, but also other sites from Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. And this project is done in collaboration with several colleagues, archaeologists, bioanthropologists, and geneticists from the Museum of Natural History in Paris and from the CNRS. But let's back to Tappeh Sialk. In the museum, Tappeh Sialk is a collection counts 39 human samples, so some of them from the Neolithic period, others from the Chalcolithic, and half of them from the last period, from the Iron Age period, and come from the excavation by Roman Girschman in the 30s. It is noteworthy that we are very proud in the museum to have this collection here, and this collection is exhibited in the museum, so any visitor of the museum can see these samples as very representative of the first human living in civilization, in complex civilization. So really it's a peer for our Museum anthropological collection. But nonetheless, we managed to obtain the authorization for sampling for this genetic and isotope analysis. So we've decided to sample teeth and bones. Teeth are for studying diet during childhood using isotope, and bone from studying diet during adulthood. And we will try to amplify DNA from these two kind of samples, especially from the petrous bone when it was possible to sample it. So let's begin with the DNA analysis. As it has been noted before, this area is a hot area with a high mean temperature, which is detrimental to the preservation of ancient DNA, and the risk of contamination by our modern DNA is very high. So we will take advantage of the presence of the clean room in the museum for analyzing human remains. So this is our clean room in which we'll perform all the DNA analysis, extraction and preparation of the sequencing. So this clean room has a high air pressure and UV light, and we're working under this hood. And this is one of my colleagues in a typical dress for working in this clean room with mask and hairnet and a combination and 2 pairs of gloves. So all these precautions are taken to avoid any contamination by human DNA. So after, we will take some bone or teeth and reduce them to powder, because DNA analysis needs to destroy a part of the skeleton, so sometimes it's difficult to obtain authorization for sampling. And we will extract, purify, and concentrate the DNA from this powder. So then we will test for DNA preservation using classical methods in biology. And here we have already tried on 2 samples from the Sialk collection, and as you can see, for one of the samples we have a quite good preservation of human DNA. So I was surprised, I must confess, because the climatic conditions are not good for DNA preservation, but it was a really happy surprise. And then we will try to determine the mitochondrial haplogroup. Mitochondrial genome is a part of the genome which is transmitted only from maternal lineage, so from mother to child. So one has the mitochondrial genome of its mother, maternal grandmother, and so on. And with this, we will try to analyze the potential the mitochondrial diversity in this population. And for the samples that with a very high DNA preservation, we'll try to sequence the nuclear genome. So nuclear genome is transmitted both by the father and by the mother. So it gives insight into the whole genetic diversity of a population. So that's for the DNA analysis. In parallel, we will we will analyze isotope ratio. So first in the collagen, nitrogen, and carbon isotope ratio. So we will test for collagen preservation. And for the first 2 samples, it was also very good. And measure the delta of nitrogen isotope ratio on the delta on carbon isotope to estimate, well, a broad knowledge on the diet. So what was the amount of animal proteins? Did people eat C4, such as millet plants? What's the amount of fresh fish proteins, and so on in the diet? So we will have an insight into the diet of the populations. And parallelously, we'll analyze the strontium isotope, which can provide an information and the geological context in which an individual grew up. So by comparing with animals and other human remains, we will try to understand if the population seen in Sialk is born in Sialk or come from another area, or if some of the individuals studied are migrant, come from another area. And together with all this information, all this molecular information, we will also study the health state of the population by studying the wear pattern. And I must confess, I am not a specialist, but just at looking at the skulls, there are some really interesting things that appear. We will also look for stress indicators that can give an idea of the amount of stress during childhood that may be caused by lack of food, for example. And we will also study the incidence on dental caries and try to link this with the diet that has been studied through isotope. So in the end, those are the questions we will try to answer. Who were the inhabitants of Tappeh Sialk? Did the population was the same in the different periods, or did the population replacement occurred? What did they eat, and how this diet influenced their health state? And if the DNA preservation is good, we will try to go more further into social issues. So, for example, is the diet of the children and the adult different, or is the diet of the males and the female different? And did the mobility differs between male and female? Do the women come from another village, another place when they're married? I'll leave you the conclusion.
So we'll have. So there are many important informations to expect in the coming years. So we come to some conclusions. So what we can say about the bioarchaeological remains: plant formations around the site in the past are not very different in the composition from what they are today. We find the same species that you would find in the area today. It's impossible to, so we have gallery forest and open shrublands. It's impossible with the charcoal analysis to speak about the density and the quantity of trees and shrubs in the area, but we might suspect that there was a more dense vegetation cover in the past, and especially in the Neolithic. This was a more favorable period and less impact on by human activities. And would really hope that the vegetation was more dense, because what you see today is something that's very, very open and very few tree species. The agricultural economy, since the beginning, since the Neolithic, is based on cultivated plants, domestic plants, barley, emmer, wheat, and then we have a shift from emmer to free-threshing wheats, and that's something that's very classical, not only in Sialk, but all over Iran, and in fact all over the Middle East, where you have hulled wheats in the Neolithic, and then you shift to bread wheat in the later periods, especially in the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age. What I didn't mention before is that cereal chaff, you find it in the shape of seeds, but also a lot in the mud bricks as a temper, and they use the chaff. That's the cleaning. When they harvest and you clean the crops, you get this refused chaff that you will use as a temper in the bricks that will reinforce the bricks. So you have whenever in the ziggurat, or not in the ziggurat, in the platform, and also in the mud brick constructions from the Neolithic, you have, if you break them, you have cereal impressions in those building materials. Grape is present since the Iron Age, probably cultivated earlier, but that remains to be proven by more studies. Fauna studies indicate an arid environment. We have this wild arid environment species, hemiones, gazelle, and we have also some animals from the Piedmont environment, the wild caprini. And then we have a reliance, domestic animals are present since the Neolithic, and a reliance on pastoralism, and with a very big part of caprini, but also cattle in the Neolithic and also in the later periods, and with the apparition after by domesticated equids. And then we have the ongoing projects on the Guichemin collections in Paris, so there are no results yet, but that's something to come. And to finish, we would like to send a salam to our special friend Abbas Etemad, who has spent his life in Sialk, and a fantastic person, and who worked with Guichemin when he was a young teenager. He's a mason, and his father worked with Guichemin, and he also worked with Guichemin when he was young, and can tell many stories about this, the early excavations at Sialk. And he's still there. Thank you very much.